Do not buy this game. I'm just going to lay that out there nice and bluntly, okay? Where do I even begin with this thing? I wasn't a huge fan of the new Colossus's gameplay, but it did a lot of things very right on the story axis for me. A lot of great scenes, a lot of great voice acting, a lot of great characters. Now imagine worse gameplay, and all of that story stuff turns into negatives, and you've got this game. There's your 5-minute rumination. Honestly, this is probably going to be a pretty short one, despite being a lamentation, because most of what this game does wrong is simply being boring. There's only so many ways you could describe something that is boring. But I'm going to try. So, what does the game do well? The brickwork is pretty good. The doodad utilization was pretty good. Abby was actually a decent character. Let's see. The game did have good graphics, and it is a full co-op game. That's it. That's all I got. Gameplay axis. Before I go forward, though, I have a weird feeling, and it's just speculation based on analysis, that this is a game made by multiple teams and or studios who were not coordinating or communicating with each other. And I don't just mean in the obvious ways. I mean, like, it feels like certain chunks of level design and enemy design and the leveling system and the mechanics thereof and the mechanics of the gun upgrades and the stat distribution, all that, were all being designed by different teams who didn't think about the other aspects of gameplay. One of the things I talked about semi-recently in Resident Evil 4 is how having a good mechanic or having a good system in a game is nice, but ultimately it doesn't work that way. Games need to have mechanics and systems that work with each other. And indeed, when you have systems and mechanics that really work with each other, it magnifies, it makes it even better than it otherwise was, like in Resident Evil 4. So the truly great games have all sorts of interlocking systems that are all just kind of awesome, not just by themselves, but because of how they complement each other. This is the total opposite of that, or I guess the inverse. Because what we have here is a bunch of systems and mechanics which are bad, no, I guess this is the opposite, which are bad and don't complement each other. Going through the airship in the first level was brilliant. Wonderful visuals and excellent storytelling in the background and in the style of getting across the idea of the decadence of Paris-occupied, Nazi-occupied Paris, excuse me. Paris occupied by the Nazis. I was stuttering over that. And then we see this excellent visuals and this excellent styling, except in the actual dungeons, where the lighting design actually is not conducive towards gameplay at all. Not just because of the fact that in some cases it's hard to see, but for some areas we have these so-called underground areas. There's several of them. They're regular. They all follow the same pattern. You go down and you have a very, very dark area. So dark that you essentially can't see what you're doing unless you pull out your flashlight. Okay, no problem. While you pull out your flashlight, you can only use your pistol or your machine pistol. Okay, still not necessarily a problem. What becomes a problem is while you're in there, you fight far too many enemies with far too much health and far too much armor. Now, hang on, it actually gets worse, because you can pull out your regular gun and essentially fire blind because you can't see, but it gets even worse than that because they can see you just fine and without issue. You see how these systems kind of run into each other and go contrary to each other rather than actually working well. We have a bad flashlight system and a bad limitation on gunplay system combined with bad encounter design and bad enemy design. And all of these just kind of smash into each other to make the game bad. One of the other things that I ran into was, of course, the AI. From what I'm told, the AI was actually worse at launch. That's impressive, because the AI is aggressively stupid. To be clear, I mean the co-op AI. The enemy AI is bog standard. It's the kind of AI I've seen since Doom. The original Doom. I don't have much to say about it. But the companion AI is what I would call actively terrible. Imagine you're fighting a melee-centric enemy with a flamethrower. So naturally, you, with your ranged weapon, are going to charge right up in front of it and try to attack it as much as possible. Imagine that I am in a downed state and you need to res me. And you're just going to stand there out of combat looking at me, not doing anything or bothering to res me because I haven't hit the res me button. There's lots of examples of this. I'm not going to go down the list. The AI sucks. Now, I understand that there's only so much you can do about that. We actually talked about this in Portal 2 as well. A co-op game is co-op game, and some games are just straight up co-op required. A Way Out or It Takes Two both come to mind immediately for games that are just straight co-op, or the aforementioned Portal 2 co-op campaign. But in this case, the AI is so aggressively bad, and you're probably thinking, well, how could they design a better AI? Well, admittedly, that would take a lot of time and effort. So what you do is you cheat. The way you design an AI to actually be worth a damn is you cheat in terms of how it operates or how it functions. Maybe it ignores certain AoE attacks. Maybe it does more damage in these kind of situations. Like, for example, let's say you design the AI so that it starts attacking someone, and it doesn't really matter if it hits them, and it doesn't really matter how much damage it's doing, because after attacking them for X period of time consecutively, the enemy, like a separate flag is triggered, and the enemy just starts taking damage to their armor, to their health, because the AI is attacking them to simulate a player who knows their weakness and is using it properly. This is what I mean by cheating. You could use those little kind of tricks in order to make AI worth a damn. They don't. It's not. Then we have the HUD, which is actively unhelpful and in many cases flat out doesn't work at certain distances. We've got the fact that the enemies have entirely too much health. We have the fact that there's far too many enemies per encounter. We've got the fact that the game is buggy. First thing that happened to me, I need to plug this back in, speaking of which, so I have a PS3 controller here that I use. This is my PC controller, and I leave it plugged in because I use it on a semi-regular basis. In fact, I plan to use it tomorrow. However, if I have this plugged in, what ends up happening, I'm not actually going to do that because I just realized I don't have it muted, but if I have this plugged in, I've never seen this happen before. The game waged a war between the controller and the mouse and keyboard. So usually what happens in a well-designed game is it recognizes which input you used last, right? So you can essentially swap on the fly between controller or mouse and keyboard, and it'll update the inputs, and it'll update the icons and whatnot to address that immediately. That's a good game. A not-so-good game will assume you have one or the other, but will at least acknowledge both. This game did something I think I've seen before, but I couldn't tell you what off the top of my head, where, so every time I tried to move the mouse, it would be like, okay, starts moving the mouse, and then frames later, less than a second later, it would be like, wait, no, you have a controller, and you're not moving the controller, so then it would stop. But then because I'm still moving the mouse in the second that I've moved the mouse, it starts moving again, but then it stops again, but it moves again, stops. And it just rapid fires back and forth between controller and mouse. I quite literally could not access the main menu to start the game or even access the options without unplugging my controller. This was a bad sign of things to come, because this is the first thing I learned about this game. I mean, everyone talks about how this game is bad, and it is. But that was my actual first exposure to the game. My second exposure to the game was starting up the game, getting disconnected from the servers and being kicked out of my single-player game for doing so, and then having to end task it because all of a sudden I couldn't interact with the game in any fashion. It wouldn't let me select anything with mouse or keyboard or anything. Let's talk about bad. One of the things that comes up a lot is the concept of so bad it's good. Now, whether that's something that is a thing or not depends on the individual. Whether or not you find something so bad or good is going to be up to you. That's how that works. But I've talked about this before. There's a lot of different gradients to bad. There's a lot of different types of bad. There's bad that's at least quick and painless, but terrible in design. Or there's bad that you just facepalm, and there's this almost kind of Schadenfreude, which I'm pronouncing incredibly wrong. Schadenfreude. There we go. About just playing through it and just like, wow, this is such a, like it's like, oh my god, this food is so bad. Here, taste this. Oh god, that's terrible. And you just want to share it, you know. But then there's this kind of game. This game is just bad. It doesn't have any other modifiers. It doesn't have any other things, and that's probably one of the worst things it could do. This is the third worst game I've ever reviewed, by the way, just to give you a bit of perspective. Beaten only by Quest 64. And, of course, Mega Man X7. The overall design is almost non-existent. There's a lot of repeated areas and repeated design with regards to the layout. There's a very bad flow to what is interactable and what you can interact with here and there. There's a huge amount of visual clutter that is constantly getting in the way of understanding or seeing what's going on the screen. Each of the dungeons sucks. The always online thing sucks. The enemy scale to your level, which sucks. The dark levels suck. I already talked about that one. The side quests are dull as dishwater and suck. There's one boss fight in the game. There's actually two. There's the boss fight and then there's the final boss. And they all suck. The outro sucked. Because during the outro, this is funny. During the outro, what happens is you fight the dude. And it's like, it takes a bit. He's got a lot of health, but whatever. Okay, sure. Then he leaves. Then you go through a platforming section where there's a lot of trash, which is designed to drain your ammo, an ammo tax, if you will. Once you've gotten past all of that, you go up and you go and fight phase 2, where he's in a jetpack flying around. And you're supposed to hit the jetpack, which I did many, many, many times to no effect whatsoever. Because I have a really strong feeling the game is actually legitimately bugged and or not designed properly. Because even though I would knock off armor of armored enemies, or hit weak points on the mechas, nothing would happen. It would be visual. There would be a whoosh, but their health wouldn't go down and it wouldn't drain any faster. They would just stand there like nothing happened and keep fighting as if nothing happened. It was purely cosmetic. Same problem with the final boss. Anyways, you finally knocked him down after throwing 700 million billion trillion ammo at him. I was very low on ammo after that fight. By the way, there's also ads in that fight. Then you go through a door and you fight him again, but this time he's on foot and he doesn't do anything except shoot you periodically. And then you kill him. That's it. Boring, dull, long, slow, padded. But hang on, it's even worse than that. One of the things we've talked about several times, we actually only codified this term a few years ago, is a concept called the hyperbeam moment. Now, the hyperbeam moment, so named for Super Metroid, is a moment in a game in which you are just kind of given something awesome. It's usually towards the end of a game, but it doesn't have to be. It's just a moment where the game just says, here, just have fun. And you're given the gravity gun powered up, or you're given... Of course, I can't think of another example. There are examples of this. I'm sure if you think about it, you can think of hyperbeam moments within games. And it's usually just a moment of, here, go nuts, have fun. And I don't know if I've encountered a hyper fail moment before, but this definitely qualifies. When we get to that outro, when we get to that final boss fight, we are given this brand new power, which sucks. The way it works is you hold down the right mouse button for a very long period of time, like 4 or 5 seconds, and then you can unleash it and do a bit of damage. And I do mean a bit of damage, a surprisingly small amount of damage, especially to armor. That's it. That's all. So, credit to Eclectic Oak for coming up with the term hyperfail moment. That's a new one to me. I want to talk about guns in-game. One of the things I've talked about many, many times is that the viscerality of a game needs to be good, especially when it comes to a shooter. I've talked about this in Doom 64 just a few weeks ago. I've talked about this in Modern Warfare yesterday. This game got a negative on viscerality. The guns barely look different from each other. The guns don't feel different from each other. They don't handle differently in any way. Their sound design is terrible and the impact they do is awful. It feels like every gun is not only identical, but is effectively a pea shooter. Before you ask, yes, I maxed out my guns in the damage set to do the most damage possible, and was still no real change in that. It was, bad. If the shooting in a shooter is bad, we have a problem. This is like Dragon Age 2 syndrome without the fun. As a quick reminder, for those of you not aware, Dragon Age 2 syndrome is when there's fun but simple gameplay. And then it's too much repetition makes it boring and makes it bad, right? Like Dragon Age 2. So, this wasn't fun to begin with, and there was far too much of it. By about the 3 or so hour mark into the game, which is not very far in, I just started avoiding encounters whenever I could. I did the last dungeon, right before the final boss, almost entirely avoiding every encounter I could, because there's a little trick you can do, where if you go and try to interact with something, the AI partner will sometimes just teleport to the thing, and immediately you do it. So rather than fight the boss in front of the door, I just run behind the boss and try to open the door, and occasionally the AI partner would go in and open the door with me, and then we'd just skip the boss fight. But you're probably here for the story, right? No, of course you're not. Why would anyone care about the story of Wolfenstein? But let me just go ahead and say that for a game that for a franchise that has nailed the story axis so well so many times, this is astonishingly bad. I mean, I could talk about how Hitler was killed off camera and serves as a major plot point that isn't brought up until the end of the game. I could talk about how the main villain is given exactly 3 scenes to characterize him and like 5 audio logs, if you even count that. Or maybe about the fact that they actually give the big reveal that the big villain who just tried to kill us and had an entire scene about how evil he was is in fact evil and plotting against us. I have no idea what the hell they were thinking with that pacing. What? Or I could talk about how events just kind of happen with no logic or reason, no connective tissue, making them make sense as event goes from event to other event. That's what we call story sequencing. Or I could talk about how the outro sucked and also included Nazi sex, which I called, by the way. Or I could talk about the big reveal scene, which was one of the worst directed scenes I've seen since we reviewed Just Cause 4. But what I really want to talk about is how bad the main characters are. And that makes me really upset for reasons I don't even know how to properly describe. So one of the things I have heard, did not confirm this, so asterisk, but based on speculation and analysis, I agree with this, is that the main characters were supposed to be younger. The 2 teenagers, the 2 20-year-olds were supposed to be much younger, drifting into more of a child soldier thing and immaturity and not knowing what to do and how to deal with it and that kind of a thing, right? And you could see a bit of bones of that. The way they interact with each other in many ways feels like 2, 8-year-olds. Not teenagers and certainly not 20-somethings. Now, they decided not to go with that, for whatever reason. But they never redesigned the writing. So they're still written like 8-year-olds. And there's our first problem. The second problem is while they... It's the main characters suck. They suck so badly. I had viewers bow out of the stream because they were getting so irritated by them. They're trying too hard, and their direction is bad. I've seen both voice actors do things in better things in other games, so I like to think that this is primarily a voice direction problem. But the other problem I could definitively point to is the writing. The dialogue is written by someone who has absolutely no idea how a child or a younger person talks or interacts with each other. There's no... You remember Final Fantasy 15, a game that has many issues, but one of the things it had really, really well was the dynamic and dialogue between the main characters. They sounded like friends. They sounded like people who were essentially brothers and had been friends for a long time. Imagine the opposite of that. These 2 act like people who barely know each other, but also happen to be working with each other. And it's a shame because you could see the bones of the ideas here. One of the mechanics in the game, which I haven't talked about yet, is there's a positivity thing. You do a pose or whatever, and you can buy different poses to do different effects, like give you armor or health, or give you like a few seconds of invincibility, or make you do more damage. You get quad damage that way, stuff like that, right? It's actually a cool mechanic and probably one of the better ideas in the game, because there's something just kind of interesting about the idea of positivity being used as a teamwork mechanic. But they don't implement it well at all. You'll notice I didn't even mention that on the gameplay axis. And so what we instead have is 2 twats who are written by 30 to 40-somethings who have no idea how them kids... I mean, the joke was made many, many times on camera, but we have to mention the how do you do, fellow kids? Because it was all over the place with the way they were talking, both to each other and to others. And then there's the banter between them, which is a non-stop cavalcade of just random, I hate to use this word, cringy dialogue. This is the kind of dialogue that needed 2 or 3 more polishing passes, going back over and smoothing out the word choice and the sentence structure to really make it pop and really make it work, and that didn't happen. And so instead what you have is 2 non-characters having to carry the weight of the entire narrative on their backs. Going to find their dad, fighting against the big evil force, outsmarting the villains, being given the responsibility. All of those moments that should have been moments weren't, because it all sits on a terrible and crumbling pillar. My tone probably gets across my point here better than anything else I could do. This game was tiring. Contrary to popular belief, I do not like being negative about games, but this game was just draining to go through. I am exhausted. Probably partially because I was supposed to go to bed like 10 minutes ago, but even anybody who watched the stream could tell, even when I was still streaming the game, by the end I was just deflating as I got further and further into the game. And then it ends on a go do the side missions and do the daily missions, but also to be continued. I have no idea what they're thinking with this, or where they're going with this, or if they'll ever do anything worth a damn with this. I hope you at least had some entertainment from the run. I'll see you next time.